The engine of the Army's most advanced tank failed during a live demonstration. 3 engineers gave it a shot. None of them could fix it. Then someone mentioned a forgotten name. That day, surrounded by tightened bolts, he didn't just fix an engine. He restored his legacy. Let's dive into this story. Former Army Sergeant Charles Rener, known simply as Chuck, is a mechanic by both calling and instinct. He never went to college. Orphaned at a young age, he grew up in foster homes, spending most of his time taking apart anything he could get his hands on just to put it back together. He was the kind of kid who would rather listen to the whine of a faulty gear than join any hallway conversation. By the age of 12, he had already repaired the orphanage's rusted laundry room hydraulics on his own. At 17, he enlisted in the Army, hoping for a better life far from the struggles he'd known. During his service, Chuck was never the talkative type, but he was always the first one they called when a vehicle broke down in the middle of nowhere or a generator failed in the dead of night. He built a quiet reputation on base as the guy who didn't make a fuss but got things done. While others followed manuals step by step, Chuck seemed to feel the pulse of the engine, to sense the rhythm of its failures. It was like he had a gift for understanding machines. Those who know him, and there aren't many, see him as eccentric. At 68, he carries the weight of 2 very different lives on his back. The first, a rough childhood that shaped the man he became. The second, a military career that effectively ended in 1982, when an explosion during an experimental engine test left metal fragments in his right leg and invisible scars on his future. His military pension barely covered his ongoing medical bills. The surgeries on his leg had drained his savings years ago, forcing him to sell the house he bought for the wife who later left him, childless, 2 years after the accident. To make ends meet, Chuck works fixing tractors on farms and heavy machinery at construction sites around Tucson, Arizona. He always arrives early, his old pickup truck creaking down the dirt roads, a rusted toolbox riding shotgun, and a black coffee in a thermos by his side. Locals know him by sight, the old man with the steady gaze and a limp in his right leg. He doesn't talk much, just asks what's broken and gets to work. Sometimes he goes entire days without saying more than 3 sentences. But when he speaks, people listen. His words are straight to the point, no small talk. Younger workers often find him odd, even unsettling. But the older folks get it. Chuck's not there to socialize. He's there because something is broken. And when something breaks, it somehow always calls for him. He lives alone in a small converted shed behind an old shut-down repair shop. It's a modest space, but Chuck doesn't complain. He doesn't know any other way to live. Fixing things is how he exists. Every strange sound, every offbeat vibration, every failure, it's a language to him. And in that language, Charles Rener still feels useful, still finds meaning. His old phone almost never rings. But that day, it did. On that Monday morning, Chuck was finishing repairs on a John Deere 5E series tractor's hydraulic system when the call came in. "Mr. Rener, this is General Kurtz from Fort Huachuca. We need your help. It's urgent." Chuck nearly laughed. It had been decades since anyone called him Mr. with that kind of respect in their voice. "I think you've got the wrong guy, General." "Negative. You're Charles Rener, former sergeant in the Army Corps of Engineers." Silence hung in the air. Chuck wiped his hands on his worn-out jeans and looked back at the tractor. He thought about hanging up, but there was something in the general's voice, something he hadn't heard in years. That tone you only hear in times of crisis. An hour later, Chuck was driving down the road toward Fort Huachuca. The desert dust clung to his windshield, casting a dull veil between him and the military complex rising on the horizon. It had been 26 years since he'd stepped onto a military base. His heart beat out of rhythm, caught somewhere between curiosity and a deep, aching nostalgia. He parked near the entrance gate, took a long breath, grabbed his old tool case from the back seat, and walked toward the guard post. The soldier at the gate couldn't have been more than 22. His eyes scanned Chuck from head to toe, lingering on the worn-out boots, faded jeans, and hole-ridden shirt. The toolbox looked like it had survived a war. "Name?" Charles Rener. I was called in by General Kurtz. The young soldier checked a clipboard, frowning. There's no Charles Rener authorized for today. Chuck stayed calm, his hands relaxed at his sides. He'd learned long ago that explanations only made situations like this worse. Mind confirming with the general while I wait? The soldier hesitated, then picked up the phone. The conversation was brief, punctuated with, "Yes, sir," and "Understood, sir." When he hung up, his expression had shifted, just slightly. "The general's in a meeting. Sergeant Williams will escort you." Sergeant Williams showed up 2 minutes later. "Mr. Rener, I'm Sergeant Williams. The general asked me to take you to Hangar 7. They walked silently across the yard and through the base corridors. Chuck noticed the curious looks from younger soldiers, the hushed conversations that stopped as they passed. Williams kept a slightly faster pace, forcing Chuck to speed up despite the limitation in his right leg. "Do you work for a defense contractor, sir?" Chuck hesitated. "I do maintenance work." Williams nodded, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Chuck knew exactly what the sergeant was thinking. Hangar 7 was massive, with a high steel ceiling that amplified every sound. In the center, partially covered with tarps, sat a military vehicle Chuck recognized immediately, one of the new hybrid generation tanks. He'd only seen specs on it years ago. 3 men in white lab coats were hunched over the exposed engine, their voices echoing frustration. As Williams and Chuck approached, one of them, a bald man in his 40s, looked up. "Sergeant, is this the specialist?" The tone wasn't exactly rude, but it carried obvious skepticism. Chuck could feel the weight of judgment in their eyes. "Sir, this is Charles Rener." The bald man wiped his hands on a cloth and extended one. "Dr. Carson, lead engineer on the project. Honestly, we're a bit surprised. We were expecting someone a little more younger," added the thin engineer with glasses, "with more up-to-date credentials." Chuck shook Carson's hand, eyes already on the hybrid engine in front of him. It was a technological work of art. Some systems he recognized, others that looked like they'd evolved past anything in his experience. What seems to be the problem? This is a stealth hybrid engine designed to lower battlefield heat and noise signatures. But the prototype has a critical failure. It loses power after about 15 minutes of operation. We've checked all electronics, sensors, fuel injection, cooling systems. Nothing worked. Then someone brought up your name. The project stuck. And time is not on our side. Chuck stepped closer to the engine, his hands instinctively moving to key inspection points. He could feel the engineer's impatient stares behind him. "Mind if I take a look?" Carson waved vaguely. "Sure, but we've had 5 specialists here this week. We spent days running diagnostics. It's not a simple issue." Chuck opened his toolbox and pulled out a small flashlight and a mechanical stethoscope, an old-school device younger techs might find outdated. He began examining the engine methodically, ignoring the whispered comments behind him. "He's really using that," the man with glasses muttered to Carson. "Maybe we should explain this isn't a truck from the 60s. It's an advanced hybrid system," Carson said, his voice rising slightly. Chuck continued his inspection for 20 minutes, testing connections, listening to subtle sounds no one else seemed to hear. Finally, he stopped at a specific section of the engine and stood still for a long moment. "Did you find something?" Carson asked, clearly impatient. Chuck closed his toolbox and turned to the engineers. "The problem isn't in the engine." "What do you mean?" "It's in the system integration. There's a micro-vibration in the mounting base that only shows up once the engine heats up and expands. That thermally induced micro-vibration creates harmonic dissonance, throwing off the sync between the combustion engine and the electric drive." The 3 engineers exchanged glances. "Mr. Rener," Carson said slowly, "with all due respect, that's not possible. We've tested all the mounting bases. Did you test them at room temperature?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "Did you check the vibration dampers after 15 minutes at full heat?" The man with glasses glanced at a clipboard. "The dampers are within factory specs. Factory specs were made for conventional engines. This hybrid system generates a different vibration pattern. The failure only happens after the system heats up. It's easily missed by static or cold diagnostics. Carson folded his arms. Mr. Rener, with all due respect, that sounds like guesswork. We need concrete data. Chuck nodded, picked up his toolbox, and started walking toward the exit. Where are you going? Williams asked. You don't need me. You already know more than I do. Chuck left the hangar without rushing, his silhouette leaning slightly to the right from the old injury. Behind him, the three engineers stood in silence, watching him go. Out in the parking lot, Chuck started his truck and sat there for a few minutes with his hands on the wheel. He didn't feel angry, just a familiar kind of tired. The man everyone underestimated, until they needed him. And even then, they preferred not to believe. Hours later, Chuck's phone rang while he was washing dishes after dinner. It was Carson, but his tone had completely changed. Mr. Rener, this is Dr. Carson. I owe you an apology. You were right. We tested the mounting base after prolonged heat exposure and found the micro vibration in the dampers, exactly as you described. Chuck dried his hands slowly. I need you to come back, sir. General Kurtz would like to speak with you in person. The next day, Chuck returned to Hangar 7. But this time, the atmosphere was different. Carson was waiting with a man in military uniform, whom Chuck recognized by his insignia as a general. Mr. Rener, General Kurtz said, extending his hand. I owe you an apology for the way you were received yesterday. There's no need, General. Yes, there is, sir. Dr. Carson explained what happened. He also told me you identified a failure that our team of specialists couldn't find in an entire week. Mr. Rener, the engine you examined is built on principles you helped develop over 40 years ago. The mounting dampers you flagged as faulty were originally designed using your own specifications. The hangar fell silent. Carson and the other engineers listened in with a mix of curiosity and growing discomfort. Sergeant Rener, Kurtz continued, using Chuck's military rank for the first time, may I ask why one of the architects of the military hybrid propulsion program, who just saved a multi-million-dollar project, is working outside our military system? Chuck could feel their eyes on him. It was the question he'd been waiting to hear for 26 years, one he never knew how to answer without sounding like self-pity. There was an accident during testing, sir, back in '82. I was blamed for it, and I ended up with a permanent injury to my leg. After that, they saw me as a liability. I understand, Kurtz said quietly. Carson stepped forward, visibly uneasy. Mr. Rener, I sincerely apologize. Chuck gave a small nod. Doctor, don't worry. It's all right. Kurtz stepped closer to Chuck. Sergeant, may I make a proposal? We have other projects facing serious issues. Would you be willing to— General, Chuck gently interrupted. I appreciate the offer. I really do. But that chapter's behind me now. That's not who I am anymore. With all due respect, Sergeant, you have a gift, you always have. But I respect your decision. Then allow me to make one more proposal, Sergeant. The general pulled an envelope from his pocket. This is to cover the service you provided, and the recognition you should have received years ago. Chuck didn't take it right away. He just looked at the folded paper, then at the general's hand. I didn't do it for that, sir. I know, Kurtz replied. That's exactly why you deserve more than what's in this envelope. Chuck finally took it and slid it into the pocket of his jacket without opening it. He looked one last time at the tank at the far end of the hangar. The artificial lights reflected off its side panels. There was no more noise, no more shaking, no more failure. The next morning, Chuck was finishing up the hydraulic cylinder adjustment on the John Deere 5E series tractor when he heard tires crunching on the dirt road. A black SUV pulled up near the barn. Dr. Carson stepped out. He leaned against the SUV's bumper, the morning sun casting a sharp light across his face. Sergeant, I had to come here and tell you something in person, if I may. Of course, Doctor. You know, Sergeant, when you identified that micro-vibration, I felt small. Small because I've always seen myself as very smart, maybe even better than others. But clearly I was wrong. I've spent years surrounded by experts, PhDs, engineers, young minds with shining diplomas on the wall. But none of them had the sensitivity you showed in that hangar. You heard something no one else could hear. Chuck looked out toward the horizon where the desert met the sky. He picked up a rag and slowly wiped his hands, unhurried. Learning has everything to do with listening, with humility. Machines always give a warning when something's out of place, but not everyone has the patience to understand them or the humility to listen to someone who does. Carson lowered his head, thoughtful. He took a deep breath, then reached out and shook Chuck's hand. One final gesture of gratitude for what he had just learned about life. As Dr. Carson slowly disappeared down the dirt road in his SUV, Chuck Rener stood watching. There he remained, between two worlds, carrying within himself the quiet proof that a person's true worth is never lost. It simply waits for the right moment to be rediscovered by those wise enough to look beyond appearances with humility. If you enjoyed this story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next.